Thank you very much for putting the paper on the program. This is joint work with Valentin Kecht, who is with us here today, and Alessandro Lizzeri. And given the very theme of this conference, what we mean by the very top is, of course, the very top of corporations and therefore CEOs. And it seems that, there you go, that they seem to be getting older, not only here, but also in Europe. Leading some commentators to go so far as to call this America's corporate gerontocracy. And whether that's concerning or not, that's an open question. So what we're going to do today is ask three questions, namely, how have these age structures among CEOs changed? How could this possibly be related to the employment histories up to becoming CEOs and their career paths? And which market features can explain these trends? And to answer the three questions, we're going to first document the development of CEO age across firms and over time, then use granular data to discern any structural changes in their employment histories up to being nominated as CEO or appointed, and then explore factors that have contributed to older CEO appointments since 2000. Short preview of the results. Indeed, CEO age at appointment has increased substantially since 2000, up to 8 years. And just for comparison, that's much more than the aging of the college-educated labor force, 3 times as much, even more than that. And not only has CEO age gone up, but also the career paths of these prospective CEOs have changed in that they now amass much more external experience and exhibit greater labor market mobility. And our interpretation is going to be that this is a reflection of them accumulating generalist skills. And it's on the one hand, firms demanding these generalist skills in order to navigate an increasingly uncertain and complex world. On the other hand, executives who are, of course, career-minded individuals responding to that greater demand for generalist skills by providing them and steering their career paths accordingly. We're going to show you causal evidence for both channels, the demand and the supply side of generalist skills, and then engage in a little quantitative decomposition of the aggregate trend, where we will come to the conclusion that the demand side seems to hold the greatest explanatory power for observed CEO age increase. All right, before I get to the stylized facts, let me just tell you quickly about the data. On the one hand, we're using Bordex. I don't think I have to introduce that data set to this audience, but we're complementing Bordex also with LinkedIn data. And the way I would like you to think about the LinkedIn data in this case is to really treat it as a poor person's matched employer-employee data set that you can use to dig deeper into people's employment histories. And we combine it with Bordex at the firm level using a fuzzy merge algorithm and have been fairly successful with that, matching 65%. So without further ado, the raw facts. As I mentioned before, CEOs have aged more than the college-educated or the regular labor force. Now, you may immediately think, yeah, maybe that is due to entrenchment, maybe that's to longer tenure, but the slope of this phenomenon is, for the most part of our sample period, similar for sitting CEOs and CEOs upon being appointed. So that doesn't seem to be driving it. We can also see this by looking at accumulated distribution functions. Every decade, they move further to the right, getting older and older upon appointment. And as you see in the right-hand side panel, this is a phenomenon pertinent in particular to the smaller firms. They see the largest slope in CEO age. Now, zooming in on what could possibly be correlated with this higher CEO age, it seems that years of external experience have gone up rather than internal experience. And regardless of whether we're looking at CEOs that are internally promoted or externally appointed, they both, before becoming CEOs, have amassed more external experience. And again, it's more pronounced for the smaller firms, the red dots that you see here. Zooming in on this external experience, where it's coming from a larger number of positions they took up at more firms, and they even switched sectors more often. Now, along the intensive margin, they spent fewer years per position and firm, but the net effect is still positive. So what I'd like to do next is to walk you through the bare bones of a theoretical model that we have in a paper to discipline our thinking of the determinants of CEO age. Bear with me, it's short, okay? So what we have is a frictionless many-to-one matching model with transfers among heterogeneous workers, heterogeneous firms. The workers are heterogeneous along 2 dimensions. First of all, their ability, and second, their experience. And both have components that are concave functions of age. The firms are heterogeneous in their productivities, and this is related to their firm size, plus each firm has a fixed number of hierarchically ordered positions with different productivity requirements. As a result of associative matching, what will happen here is that each firm for its most important job will pick the most productive worker, and that's going to be the CEO. And with that, we can already come up with a set of key results that we enlarge upon in the paper. First of all, on average, the CEOs of smaller, lower productivity firms are younger. Now, the thought experiment we do is we jack up alpha, which is the weight that determines an individual worker's productivity at a given firm placed on their experience, the importance of experience. When that weight goes up, this alpha goes up, what we see is we have an age increase across the board among all CEOs, but particularly so to smaller firms. Why? Because initially, due to the assortative matching, the large firms have already had this kind of self-selection, and they have the most experienced productive workers. So you have a much greater slope for the smaller firms, more reordering of older CEOs among the smaller firms. And we have a simple numerical example that beautifully encapsulates that, if I may say. So here on the x-axis, we have the firm size deciles, going from smallest to largest. On the y-axis, we have mean CEO age. The blue dots, the blue lines correspond to a lower alpha, a lower weight on experience. And you see what I mentioned before, that the average age of the CEO is smaller, lower than at the largest firms. But once we jack up the alpha, we see that they converge, right? The small firms all of a sudden have much older CEOs, almost matching the age of the largest firms. Now, let me take you from functional form assumptions to the data. And the idea is to test this by understanding better whether firms' demand for experience can drive CEO age. And why might firms demand this kind of experience as in the model? Well, possibly because they appreciate that with experience comes being a generalist. And why would firms want generalist skills, or why would they seek generalist skills in a CEO? Well, potentially to navigate an increasingly uncertain and complex world. Now we can philosophize a lot about what that actually means. In the paper, we're fairly open about how to define that crazy world that we're actually living in, and have been living in for a while, actually, because this phenomenon is pertinent to the early 2000s. But you can think about it in terms of industry level uncertainty, like more volatile cash flows. You can think about it in terms of business diversification. Are you in different segments? Okay. Spatial diversification, like firms becoming bigger, and now the branches and facilities, they're all over the country, and you have to manage a fairly diverse workforce. Or simply trade-induced complexity by expanding on your international trade network and exporting to countries that you know little about, or more complex countries simply. So countries that are very different from yours, right? For all of these factors, it would come in extremely handy ex ante to have a generous CEO. Now, to resolve the potential heterogeneity of CEO age upon appointment to industry level uncertainty, we use plausibly exogenous spatial variation in the availability of young generalists. Reason being that if it's truly the case that industry level uncertainty leads to firms demanding more generalist skills, only then we should see the availability of young generalists play any role. Otherwise, it shouldn't matter for the age of the subsequently appointed CEO. So what are these young journalists I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of top strategy consultants. Explicitly, we're looking at McKinsey, BCG, and Bain. Why? Because these are pressure cookers for journalists. In your first 3 years as a fellow at McKinsey, you're seeing a bunch of industries, different firms, and it's all going by very fast, right? So these are people that at an enormously fast pace become generalists. And how do we go about measurement? Well, we look at metro area variation in the flight time to the closest McKinsey, BCG, Bain office, meaning that we're using two underlying sources of variation. One, the fact that since 2000 in the US and elsewhere, these three companies have opened a bunch of offices. And second, we're using air route expansions. The interaction of the two will inadvertently lead to time variation in the flight time to the closest McKinsey, BCG, Bain office. And then we run the following regression. We look at the age of a CEO appointment and relate that to the interaction of this measure of a low supply of young generalists, which is measured in the flight time to the next McKinsey, BCG, or Bain office, interacted with uncertainty, which is an industry-level characteristic that varies over time. Right, so the identifying variation is at the industry, metro area, time level, allowing us to simultaneously control for time-varying unobserved heterogeneity at the metro area level and time-varying unobserved heterogeneity at the industry level. Now, our conjecture then is that when uncertainty is high and COH should go up if the supply of generalists is low, because they're simply not around. You would want to have them, but you can't have them. So you wind up hiring an older CEO who got her or his experience elsewhere at a slower pace. And this is exactly what we find. In the third row, we see this. The coefficient is positive and significant throughout. To give you a sense of the economic magnitude, though, so for industry-level uncertainty, we use industry-level sales growth volatility, and we standardize it to have a zero mean, standard deviation of 1. So if evaluated at 1 standard deviation above the mean, uncertainty, an additional hour in travel time translates to a CEO that is 7 to 8 months older upon appointment. And as I mentioned before, we have analogous results for other drivers of firm-level demand for general skills, for example, trade-induced complexity, business diversification, and lacking diversification, spatial diversification of a firm, so when the offices are spread out. Why? Because we believe it's a realistic depiction that all of these factors somehow feed to greater demand for generalists. It's not only the one component that matters. All of them somehow draw the picture that leads to firms needing these generalist skills. All right, and this actually equips us with a unique opportunity for grasping the causal effects of appointing an older CEO on firm-level performance. Think Bertrand Shue, just with causality and new source of variation, and 2 decades later. So what am I thinking of concretely? I'm thinking of we're thinking of a two-step procedure. In the first step, we're looking at different firm-level outcomes and estimating, regressing those on work CEO by firm fixed effects, okay? So these estimated CEO by firm fixed effects tell us like the average performance of a given CEO in a firm along certain dimensions, right? And then relate those to that CEO's age upon appointment, except that CEO age upon appointment, we can instrument with the interaction term I showed you before, low supply times uncertainty. And we have seen before, it has a strong first stage. So when we do that, we find that older CEOs upon appointment have a negative effect on employment growth. They have a negative effect on R&D growth. They also adversely affect these firms' patenting behavior, but in particular in terms of computing-related patterns, possibly confirming your deepest fears that these old people at the helm are simply not at the technological frontier. There is a bright side to it. I will just quickly allude to it, but not show you that. No, I mean, these firms are rational in hiring them. Namely that when it comes to business cycle shocks, these older CEOs are good at dampening the consequences of those. So we're talking about a world with lower risk but also lower return possibly. Now, outside the scope of the model, because we do not endogenize supply of skills in the model, we can still look at it empirically, because if it's true that empirically firms have exhibited this secular shift in the demand for general skills, then executives, being rational as they are, they might as well steer their career paths accordingly and deliver those to them, right? So let's see whether they do so. And the sufficient statistic that we look at for this purpose is job switches across firms to less senior positions, downward moves, okay? We're focusing on this particular move because it's consistent with the idea of acquiring general skills while possibly sacrificing long-run salary growth. Imagine you being in industry, in pharma, and you're switching to tech to experience something new. Inadvertently, you will probably start off at a lower ranked position, but you're seeing something new. And you're also working on your generalist profile. That's the kind of downward switch we're thinking of here. And indeed, if you look at the share of CEOs that ever moved downwards across firms in their careers, so looking back, right? In each year, looking at the appointed CEOs and looking back at their employment history, we see that the fraction of those who ever moved downwards has gone up tremendously from 17% to 41%. Seems like a thing now. Now, you may immediately argue, well, maybe it's involuntary. There's a competition out there, you have to move more often and then sacrifice seniority. Yes, which is why we need an identification strategy to dig out those voluntary switches. And the way we go about that is to follow the idea that workers emulate successful career moves of their former co-workers. One of your former co-workers becomes a CEO elsewhere, and you're thinking, what did it take her to become so successful? Did I learn from that it's maybe beneficial in the long run to sometimes acquire general skills by moving downwards? And that's exactly the kind of differences design that we're building around such information shocks and the value of job mobility, where the treatment is basically a former co-worker becoming CEO within 10 years after leaving a firm and having switched firms at least once. And then we're looking at workers that worked with that person previously in the same firm, same seniority level, but the treated group worked also in the same metro area. The control group did not. So we're focusing on firms that have multiple metro areas where they're active, okay? So the treated group is simply more connected to that former co-worker who has now become CEO. So arguably for them, the information shock is stronger. And then we can regress for worker W in year T. We can regress the outcomes for such a worker and relate that to the information shock, which, as I mentioned before, varies at the firm by seniority level. And then we exploit variation across metro areas, all the while controlling for worker and firm seniority by year fixed effects. So it's all coming from the variation within the firm by seniority level cluster across metro areas. And the coefficient of interest here is beta, which compares changes in job mobility around the CEO promotion event for co-workers that were closer to the CEO versus those that were more distant. And what do we find for these more connected CEOs? They're more likely to switch firms during the 10-year window after their former co-worker becomes CEO, by 5% more likely to do so. But this doesn't seem to be driven by upward moves. It doesn't seem to be driven by lateral moves. It seems to be driven entirely by downward moves. And given that downward moves are a subset of overall switches, the relative effect is even stronger, it's 13%. And they also switch industries more often, by 6%. We then engage in a bunch of comparative studies, some of which you may deem to be sanity checks, but let me point out just two highlights. For example, the effects are stronger for employees or former co-workers with longer shared tenure. The better you knew the future CEO, the more likely you are to emulate his or her next career move. And the effects are also stronger depending on the direction of the CEO switch. So you're more likely to switch downward afterwards if your former co-worker that's eventually become CEO actually also did so on their way to becoming CEO. And last but not least, just to prove that these downward switches are more likely motivated by the pursuit of general skills, we show that the workers exhibit lower short-run imputed salary growth in response to the treatment. So they're sacrificing some salary growth for that, which is probably coming from the lower seniority job that they're taking up afterwards. The last thing I'd like to do is, after having shown you and ruled in that there is a demand and a supply side explanation for higher COH upon appointment, is to decompose this trend. And for this purpose, we're regressing COH on different combinations of fixed effects, where our the total model will comprise industry by MSA by year fixed effects plus industry by MSA fixed effects interacted with firm level controls. It's the full model, and with that we can explain 57% of the variation. Good. Now we have to go to regressions with less granular sets of fixed effects, namely at the industry level by time, at MSA level by time, the sum of the two. And the basic intuition is that the demand side factors, they captured by sectoral shifts, while the supply side factors, they hinge on variation across space, as we've seen. For example, the local availability of generalists. And then we can use Shapley values to uniquely decompose the R squared of the full model because they are invariant to the order in which regressors are added to the equation. And then we find that demand can explain of the 57% of the full model. They can explain 37%. Supply can explain 28%. And the interaction of the two explains 35%. So it seems that the vast majority is explained by components that involve in one way or another a demand-side explanation. So with that, I'm already ready to conclude. In this paper, we document an upward age trend pervasive among CEOs. We show that this can be related to firms' a greater demand for general skills, which they need to navigate a greater uncertainty and complexity. There's also a supply-side reaction in that executives strategically increase their job mobility to provide this generalist skill set. We provide evidence that having older CEOs at the helm of the firms has negative impact on firm growth and computing-related innovation, and it leaves us with further aggregate implications. First of all of this probably doesn't bode well for firms' adaptability to long-term challenges. And second, we might learn something about changes in life cycle earnings patterns at the very top, but that's for another day. For today, thank you very much. Very much looking forward to Charlie's expert comments.